Kootenay Conservation Program's Winter Webinar Series. This year, KCP's Winter Webinar Series focuses on the theme of conservation in the context of climate change, restoration and action. I'm KCP Stewardship Coordinator Adrian Shaw, and with me I have Nicole Trigg, the KCP Communications Coordinator, ensuring that the webinar series runs smoothly in the background. Kootenay Conservation Program is a broad partnership of land and water conservation and stewardship groups, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and the West Kootenays. KCP has four main priorities: increase the effectiveness, collaboration, and coordination of private land securement, increase the effectiveness and coordination of stewardship activities taking place on private lands, building financial and technical capacity of partner organizations, and serving as a network to achieve efficiencies, synergies, and ultimately greater effectiveness. The mandate of KCP is to coordinate and facilitate these conservation efforts on private land and generate the support and resources needed to maintain this effort. I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the traditional territories of the Sinaiaks First Nation, the Ktunaxa Nation, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. As we get more people joining in, I'm going to put up a few polls. First, I'll ask where you are based. So if you could just take some time to answer this poll. Great, you can see a lot of people answering. We're just waiting for additional people to log on, and we'll get an idea of who's participating. Great, I'm just going to share the results. So in the East Kootenays, we have 52%, West Kootenays 13%, and elsewhere in BC 26%, and beyond BC 9%. Thanks for filling that out. And then the next one, we are just going to talk about what your affiliation is. So I will launch that poll. And if you could answer that poll for us as we wait for additional people to log on. Great, thanks for entering that poll. And here are the results. So 21% nonprofit, 31% consultants, 31% government, 7% First Nations, and 10% other. Thank you for joining us today. And I'd just like to recognize our program sponsors and supporters. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put on events such as these. And I'd like to take you through some webinar information. The webinar will be approximately 45 minutes with up to 15 minutes for questions at the end. As an audience member, you are on mute and will be on mute for the duration of the presentation so that we don't hear distracting background noises or feedback. If you're not familiar with the Zoom platform, take a moment to locate your control panel by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. You can adjust your video layout between active speaker view, the presenter, or gallery view, the presentation. Enter any questions you have in the Q&A box, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please put your questions, comments in the chat box, and KCP Communications Coordinator Nicole Trigg will be monitoring the chat and will do her best to help you. The webinar will also be recorded and made available on our website after we finish this. So I'd like to introduce Marc Trudeau. He is a registered forest technician, having graduated with a diploma in integrated forest resource management in 1997 from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Marc has extensive experience working in the natural resource management in British Columbia. His current role as coordinator for the Rocky Mountain Trench Natural Resources Society is relatively new, and he is actively involved in delivering ecosystem restoration projects in the Rocky Mountain Trench. So now I'd like to pass the control over to Marc, and he's going to load his presentation.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? Just making sure we got volume here.
Yep, you're sounding great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Adrian. Thanks for the Kootenay Conservation Program for hosting this webinar. My name is Marc Trudeau. I'm the coordinator for the Rocky Mountain Trench Natural Resources Society. And I'm just here to kind of give you a bit of an overview of the Rocky Mountain Trench Ecosystem Restoration Program. Oh, that's not good. So, kind of like Adrian said, I think I just wanted to acknowledge basically some of the funders and the partners in the Ecosystem Restoration Program. Without the funders, we wouldn't be able to put on a lot of the treatments and programs that we do put in place. Yeah, it's fairly straightforward there. Now, I kind of want to start this presentation talking a little bit about the actual Rocky Mountain Trench Society. Who are they? What do we do? We're basically a coalition of 9 ranching, hunting, environmental, and wildlife organizations that work together really to restore and conserve the grasslands in the an open forest in the southern part of BC here. Now, the Trench Society was established in 1996 to tackle the problem of declining grasslands and open forest ecosystems in the Rocky Mountain Trench. We're a very active player in the restoration activities, and we're also a founding member of the actual Rocky Mountain Trench Ecosystem Restoration Program. We undertake on-the-ground projects, we raise funds for our own and other projects, we sponsor scientific research, we carry out ongoing communication with the public, and we advocate for the continual provincial government support on the ER program. So what is the Ecosystem Restoration Program? Well, it's a collaboration undertaken by basically 30 partnerships to restore the grasslands and open forests for the benefits of plant, animals, and people. And the partnership represents basically a full array of basically folks here. We have government agencies, First Nations, forest ranching and guide outfitting industries, wildlife conservation and hunting associations, land conservation trusts, naturalists and environmental societies, and other citizen stakeholder groups. The overall goal of the program is to try to restore 65,000 hectares of the core grasslands and open forests on Crown land, provincial national parks, private conservation properties, and First Nation reserves. So it kind of covers a fair bit of ground, different areas. So, yeah. Sorry, I got a cat here who's trying to get on me. Yeah, I just wanted to show essentially some of the kind of representative species that are basically found on the Rocky Mountain Trench in these core grasslands and open forests. Many of them are rare or at-risk species. And we try to use, a lot of these animals are used in the management of the prescriptions and the planning for the program. So we're going to talk a lot about basically open forests, open range, and I kind of wanted to just kind of explain a little bit what that looks like, and I think the photos tend to help out a lot with that. So when we're talking about open range conditions, we're looking at basically landscapes that are fairly open, lots of grasslands in it. And when we say this 75 stems per hectare, that's basically the number of trees per hectare. So you can have areas where there's no trees and other areas that have up to 75 trees per hectare, essentially. And then we'll talk about open forest conditions. And that's basically just a greater number of trees on the landscape. So still quite open. It's defined as roughly 76 to 400 stems per hectare. And this would be kind of a typical look. And it's never just one, it's not usually it's rarely like, the trees are not perfectly spaced out typically. It's kind of this mosaic. You could have clumps of trees and larger openings and still meet basically what an open forest condition looks like. So the begging question is, why do we have the ecosystem restoration program in the trench? And this is a pretty good picture to kind of basically paint that picture a little bit as to why. But basically, as long ago as the 1950s, it was becoming obvious there was a problem with the grasslands and the open forests, and they were changing basically for the worst. Basically, modern day wildfire suppression, human settlement was bringing an end to the cycle of frequent, low intensity fires that had maintained these type of ecosystems for thousands of years. The result was a creeping invasion of forest ingrowth and encroachment. The first obvious symptoms of poor ecosystem health was basically less forage for the region's herds of domestic livestock and wild ungulates. Scientists calculate that as much as 50% of the grassland and open forest landscapes in the Rocky Mountain Trench had been degraded by forest ingrowth and encroachment since the 1950s. As a result, domestic livestock, native ungulates, are exerting increasing pressure on a declining land base as they compete for forage. The remaining grassland habitats are being further degraded by noxious weeds, which may outcompete native vegetation and reduce residual forage quantity and quality. These densely stocked stands also pose an increased risk of severe insect outbreaks and catastrophic crown fires. So there's a lot of good reasons here why the program's needed, I think. And we'll see a little bit more of that as we go down the road, but the photos really do tell the picture or tell the story. Here's a quote to just kind of support, again, this ER necessity. But high fuel loads are not the only consequence of skipping fire disturbance intervals. Recent research shows that biodiversity and forage productions are reduced, wildlife habitats are altered, and forests become susceptible to insects and disease. Which I thought was a pretty good quote and pretty accurate to what we're seeing out there. So I kind of like to talk a little bit about the fire ecology. I'm not an expert in this field, obviously, but there is some great information out there. And I think, again, a lot of these photos will depict basically what we're trying to talk about here. So this is a really cool cross-section of a 400-year-old large tree that was in the Canal Flats area. And what we're seeing here, let's see if my mouse will work here. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is between 1628 and 1907, you can see all these fire scars that were basically marked on this tree. Like these larch is typically a fire adapted species. And it was basically, this is showing us just that there's this constant kind of progression of regular fire intervals happening in the valley bottom. And basically the proof is in the pudding to show that this was happening. And then from 1907 beyond, we just see less fire. So within that period, on average, that's about every 28 years a fire was happening. Let's see here. This here is a map called the Natural Disturbance Type Map, and it basically identifies different ecosystems in relation to fire. And if we look at where we are, down in the southeastern part here of British Columbia, the area that the ER program is involved in is typically in what we call the Natural Disturbance Type 4 type of area, and that's basically a frequent stand maintaining event. So fire is in there on a regular basis, as we showed in that previous photo with the cross section of the large cookie. A very standard fire maintained these areas. It was what kept the ecosystems healthy. Just to give you some numbers, essentially the trench area that we're operating in the program for here, the whole area is approximately 250,000 hectares in size. And of that 250,000 hectares of NDT4 ground, we've kind of extrapolated essentially 110,000 hectares of open forest and open range that we're trying to manage. And the ER program kind of started at that kind of target. And what they realized after probably about 5 or 10 years, it was that it was getting really difficult. They were not going to be able to meet some of these targets that they were hoping to deal with. And in 2014, the program decided to downsize the treatment areas into its core grasslands and open forests. So that went from 110 to 65,000 hectares. And I can elaborate on that a little later as to how much has been treated and whatnot. I think we're going to get into some of the kind of more interesting photos, because again, I think the photos tell the story often better than what the words do. Here's a great classic photo taken back in 1906 from Hubert Gleason, and it really depicts and shows how fire was maintaining these areas. We have these large open forests, open grassland areas, and on the opposite side we have, clearly this was just a photo taken last year, the amount of encroachment that has occurred over time there. Now this photo was taken by Randall Harris. He was the former ER team leader for the Rocky Mountain Forest District, and he's still very committed to the ER program, and he emailed me these photos just this past summer as part of his retirement old fart project, as he called it. Thank you for those photos there, Randy. Oh, and sorry, just to go back to that location, that was actually a photo kind of looking northwest of Fairmont, just to give you a bit of an idea where that is in the trench. Here's another kind of photo that again tells the story very well. This photo is taken from the Hoodoos conservation property managed by Nature Trust of British Columbia. And you're kind of looking at a Columbia Lake here. I believe it's the south end. And yeah, you can just kind of see obviously in the foreground here, just the amount of area that was traditionally maintained through fire compared to where we are today. And it's not just in the valley bottom. Often these areas, fire would encroach or climb in these southern aspects. And these areas here are typically known as, very good sheep habitat. And so it's not only impacting the lack of fire in the ground or the lower elevations, but also at the higher elevations as well. Another photo here, comparison. Again, just on the foreground here, we can kind of see in just the encroachment of trees, as well as basically just kind of a neat looking at the marshland, how it had advanced as well at the top end there. And this photo was taken, this is just the southern or northern end of Columbia Lake, I believe. Now here's another comparing photo here. We're looking at, this is an area by what they call Gold Bay on Kootenay Lake. Clearly the photo on the left identifies before the Libby Dam was put in place. And it just, again, really shows kind of these large areas that were maintained by fire. And that compared to today, this photo was taken, I believe in the 90s. Yeah, the yellow, what we're seeing here is basically what we're calling the core grasslands. It's just part of a map that I kind of took this off of. And again, another photo kind of comparing. This is the right side is a zoomed up version of this area over here. And the yellow is identifying, again, the core grassland areas that we're managing today. And the orange here is the Tobacco Plains Reservation. And this here down here is just the American border, just to kind of give you a reference as to where we are. Okay. So how are we managing the ER program? This is kind of the vision of the steering committee that steers the ER program. And essentially how the ER program has been running and operating for over almost 20 years is it's divided into kind of two components. We have the steering committee, which is kind of the larger kind of, they provide guidance and kind of the bigger picture planning essentially for the program. And they typically meet about twice a year. And then we have the operations committee. And the operations committee essentially are the doers of the program. So they take, perhaps a 5-year plan that's been adopted at the steering committee, and now they find ways to implement the projects. And that is, the operations committee kind of consists of people that are a little bit more tied into the landscape or into the land base. So you're working typically with like the stewardship foresters, some of the biologists, some First Nations, and they typically meet about twice a year as well. And they go over essentially the operational side of the treatments that they would like to implement for that year. One of the great guiding documents that's been used over time here is this is a really, really valuable piece of information here. It's called the Blueprint for Action. It basically depicts the progress and learnings from this era between 1997 and 2013. And there was a previous Blueprint for Action prior to this one as well. And it's basically a really great document that tells the story of the history of the ER program. And it really speaks to basically all the professionals that are involved in the ecosystem restoration program. And a lot of the information that you can find in this document, if you don't have one yourself, can be found on the ertrench.com website, which I really highly recommend you look at perhaps later. So just to give you a bit of a insight as to the life cycle of the restoration projects and how it works, is essentially we have the planning piece, the prescription piece, tree removal, and monitoring. So the planning is essentially typically at the steering committee stage and the operations meeting stage. It's basically looking at developing a 5-year plan, something to work off of, and then it's narrowed down into kind of the prescription stage, where we want to focus our energy on specific treatment areas. There's a great photo here of just kind of Randy Harris here on the right. I believe it's with a co-op student, Heidi Bennett, there assisting him on a field sampling day. And yeah, so basically, like I said, there's the planning. The prescription stage is a little more narrowed in, focused on essentially where the main areas are. And then we get to the implementation stage, which is the tree removal stage. And there's multiple tools that we use in the tree removal stage. And then the final piece, of course, is the monitoring. And then it just kind of feeds back into that cycle. This here is just, I want to give you kind of an overview, larger picture here of kind of the core grasslands in the Rocky Mountain Trench that we're currently trying to manage. It's part of that 65,000 hectares. There's a little bit more just to the north there. I didn't quite crop in properly there, but this just kind of shows that picture of kind of where are we dealing with, where are we working, what are the areas that we hope to continue to maintain over time. Now we kind of get into a bit more of the kind of nuts and bolts of the treatment types. How do we actually improve these ecosystems? And there's many ways to do it. Sometimes it's a combination of them. Sometimes it's just one type of treatment. All these things are basically developed in that kind of prescription stage. So the first one is logging, I think, and logging's a part of the program. It's our heavy lifters. It's what kind of allows us to go in and utilize some of this material for posts and logs and chipping. And it basically has, of course, advantages and disadvantages. But I think the advantage is that, of course, like I said, we can use some of this material to help fund basically the program, but also some of the post treatments from logging. It does come sometimes with some challenges, which is sometimes soil disturbance. It has probably the greatest impact there, but that can we try to mitigate that through trying to, scheduling the logging operations during frozen ground or winter conditions to basically hopefully minimize the amount of soil disturbance. Another tool that we use occasionally is the mastication equipment. There's a photo here of a rubber tired type loader It's quite the machine to see in operations. You don't want to be anywhere near this thing when it's actually running. But there's essentially this type of machine, as well as I've seen them on an excavator with a kind of almost like a felling head on the front, similar to what we see there. And it basically can remove a lot of these smaller diameter trees and break them up into smaller pieces. And then it basically provides that opportunity to either leave it decompose naturally on its own, or it may add to basically some fuel on the ground for a prescribed fire. They have limitations, of course, as well. The size of the trees, the height of the trees that you want to treat, in addition to basically sometimes slope and rock and things like that on the landscape. If it's too rocky, they're wrecking their machines. It just doesn't work very well. There's too much downtime and too costly. And then we got hand slashing, which is really good for removing these kind of smaller diameter trees. Works really well on different types of terrain, steep slopes. They're also good. It's a good application for places that are perhaps near rural homes and things of that nature, where you don't want to hear machinery running all day long. And it employs a lot more people. Typically, you have more people in the land base to do the work. It's typically more intensive, it can be, and it can be more costly, but that's really dependent on the range of the treatment that's being applied. So if it's just a slash and walk away in preparation for, let's say, a prescribed burn, that might be a very quick and fairly inexpensive method. But if you have to slash, pile, and burn, then it basically can drive the price up of the cost for doing that type of treatment. Of course, less soil disturbance is another benefit of doing hand slashing as well. And then we roll into the next toolbox item, which is prescribed fire. And I think this is one of the very effective tools to use out there if used properly and planned properly. It's a wonderful tool, but of course it comes with challenges and it comes with limitations as well. Some of the limitations can be timing, for example. Available crews to do the work itself. And there could also be venting issues and maybe a social license issue. There's a lot of things that can make this particular form of treatment challenging. But if done properly, it's a very effective tool, and it can come at a typically very much cheaper cost per hectare treatment. Does anyone say anything else about that? I just want to make sure here. Yeah, no, I think we're good. Now, of course, some of these areas that we want to do treatments in, we've recognized along the way that what's important to really keep in mind is we have these sometimes very high valued snags, and we want to be aware of them, and we want to know where they are, and we want to be able to save them for future use. In the past, I've seen this method here on the right, where we wrapped aluminum type around the stump of the tree area. But I think we've kind of moved away from that. I've been involved in prescribed burns myself, and I think the more effective tool that we use these days is to essentially remove some more of that fuel around these snags to essentially allow for no combustibles to be burning into the snags. So. But just a kind of picture to show some of the things that we have to think about when we're doing prescribed burns. It's not just an easy step. Here's just a great photo of kind of a before and after. In 2009, this was I believe a hand slashing operation mixed with some machinery, and I believe that post-fire, this is kind of what it looks like after. So up in North Cherry Creek, which is just kind of north of Kimberley, BC here. Nice lupins in the background there. This is a kind of a neat one, just because I was personally involved on this prescribed fire. This was out in Brewery Ridge, kind of near the Fort Steele area. And this is just a couple photos to show kind of this vegetation response, just 6 weeks after a prescribed fire. Now, as we were talking about, fire is great, but it requires a lot of good planning. There's a lot of different pieces to consider when trying to use this option of treatment. A lot of times, some of these prescribed burns were in people's backyards, and you know, there's a lot of like planning that needs to go in to ensure that people's homes are protected, but there's also social buy-in as well to do the work. There's a lot of high values to manage for, essentially. Some of the objectives that we're trying to achieve, of course, with these prescribed burns is that we're trying to, like, the whole point of doing them is to essentially try to reduce those fuel loads that have been building up on the ground, trying to kill some of these young regen trees that are under 33 meters. We also want to try to maintain a seed bank and nutrients by creating kind of these low intensity fires that, you know, help maintain the area. And the other challenge, of course, is just timing of the burn, right? We're being able to do it so that we're avoid killing the grass growing points. And we also don't want to damage and kill a lot of these kind of like larger trees, the co-dominant and dominant trees. We want those to basically get fire scarred and kind of become fireproof to assist in a healthier ecosystem here. Well, this is a great photo because it just kind of really shows kind of like what we're trying to achieve here after these prescribed fires. And what we're looking for is we're trying to mimic what happened naturally in the past, which was these kind of low intensity fires that you know, really, you know, killed the baby trees here and you know, burned off the kind of like the little loading of fuel on the floor and scarring of these kind of larger trees to harden them up, and to help just kind of develop this more resilient ecosystem again. This is just an aerial photo here, taken obviously from a helicopter. This was a prescribed burn that's just kind of southwest of Elko, BC here. And thanks to Andre Achalabe, he was the one who provided me with some of these great prescribed burn fires photos. He's the fire boss, one of the fire bosses in the Cranbrook Fire Base here. But yeah, this is just a really nice photo identifying what we're looking for in a prescribed fire. We're looking for that kind of low intensity fire that you can clearly tell from the color of the smoke. We're looking at white smoke. We're looking at this kind of like uneven mosaic kind of burn. It's burning where it wants to burn. And I think that, you know, this is kind of what we're looking for, kind of and it ties into kind of a larger landscape level kind of project. I think with this photo, what I was trying to point out here, I guess, was that in prescribed burns, what you're trying to do also is to use what they call logical burn units. So we have an area we want to treat. We want to put prescribed fire in the land. And what we want to do is we also want to try to minimize kind of like the adding more disturbance of and when I say that, I mean not so much with the fire aspect, but mostly like we don't want to send machines in if we don't have to kind of create these fire guards. If we're able to kind of use essentially existing roads, highways, natural barriers like that, or natural barriers, then it allows us to kind of minimize that kind of extra soil disturbance and kind of contain it in a logical area that you can kind of still achieve your goals without having to disturb a whole bunch of new soil with machinery. So clearly one of the reasons we're trying to do prescribed burns and controlled burns is to minimize these undesirable effects, what we're seeing in the land base more and more in the province these days. And this is just a good photo of a large catastrophic wildfire that's been happening in BC here. The thing with these type of fires is that what we're noticing is that, you know, these are high intensity wildfires. They're very, very intense. They're very hot, and you can tell from the color of smoke as well that that's just basically really, it's a stand-changing event. It's the kind of fire that is not just scorching the trees and removing some of the fuel loading. It's really removing what was there. Just another picture here of another high intensity wildfire here. And just for some of you who may or may not know, just kind of a few general factoids about some of the wildfires that have happened in the last couple of years. That in 2017, we had 1.2 million hectares of wildfire that burned, and the cost of $564 million. And then in 2018, there was 1.3 million hectares burned at a cost of $466 million. So these are really large fires that have been happening, and just unprecedented events that we haven't seen in the past. And this is just a great photo because I've seen these areas, and this is just a good example of essentially like this is a stand-changing fire event. This is not a natural disturbance type 4 fire that happened here. Clearly, this is a type of fire that removed everything, including the soils, and we're just kind of starting to see more of this happening in kind of the valley bottom more and more because of these areas that have been built up with ingrowth, and they have that potential for larger wildfires that basically are stand changing events as opposed to stand maintaining. This is a good quote from the General's Auditor General's report here. Yeah, just for you guys to read. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Let's see here. Okay. Sorry. And this just kind of leads me into the monitoring of the program. I'm not going to go into great details here, but it's a very important to note that it's one good key element in that process that I mentioned earlier, that life cycle of the restoration program. And the monitoring is kind of, from speaking to some of the folks that have been involved in this world a lot more than me, is this kind of typically a perfect world. It's a 3-tier approach. You have essentially like a research approach where you have specific issues that you want to know about, impacts on soil, for example, or revegetation response on burn rings. These are just good information for operational purposes. And I think the ER program has had about 5 of these done, mostly master's theses. And then we have the next, which is intensive monitoring we have 23 installations. There's 15 plots per installation, and they measure basically all the vegetation, trees, grass, shrubs, at 1, 3, 5, and 10-year intervals. And then you have your routine inspections. Put in a prescription plot and walk through the block, let's say every 5 years. Remeasure the prescription plot. You want to count the trees, maybe estimate the grass and herb layers. Just a quick data collection to provide some basic feedback to know, like, what do we need to do to treat this? Do we need to retreat it? Do we need to log it? Do we need to slash it? Do we need to prescribe burn it? Basically grab enough information to kind of justify the recommendations for your treatment. Now you can find a whole bunch more of this monitoring information and data on the ertrench.com website. And just recently, actually, there's been a great research paper by Reg Newman and Evelyn Hamilton. And if you want to read up on it, it's really great. It speaks to basically the effects of restoring burning on selected ecosystems in the southern interior Rocky Mountain Trench. So I highly recommend visiting that website. It'll really give you that extra information that you're looking for in regards to the monitoring program here. These are just some great photos that were given to me by Tim Ross, who is an ecologist and who's been also just really contributing significant information on the monitoring program in the ER. This is just a photo taken in North Waldo, which is one of the birth grounds of the ecosystem restoration program, actually, which is kind of just south of Jaffrey, BC. And this was just a shot I took out of the Blueprint for Action book. It just depicts basically where our monitoring sites. And yeah, I just want to kind of start easing my way into the end of this little bit of webinar here for you by thought this was a great quote by Dr. Harold Biswell, that, yeah, fire is a natural part of the environment. It's as important as rain and sunshine. It has always been here, and everything good has evolved with it. And I think that's just a great quote, and I think it just really, I think, it states the fact of how important fire has played a role in the health of our ecosystems. Yeah, I just want to end here by acknowledging basically a lot of the people who are involved in ecosystem restoration projects and the overall program. And I really like to take the opportunity to thank, like I said, Tim Ross for some of his contributions to the monitoring program and some photos. I'd like to thank Randy Harris as well for providing a lot of this, some of the photos and documents, and just his commitment to the ER program in general, as well as Alan Neal, who is the provincial senior ecosystem restoration specialist. He just has a real dedication to the program and has a tremendous amount of great information to provide to everybody as well. Actually, if you want to, you can actually see he's got a great webinar out on YouTube, which I'll show in the next screen here. So again, if you want some more detailed information, check out the trencher.com website for specifics. As I mentioned there, Alan Neal, I just watched actually his webinar. It was really, really interesting, very thought-provoking. Highly recommend checking it out on YouTube. As well as I saw Paul Hesburgh actually speak this spring at the Wildfire Conference in Nelson. And there's a great TED Talks on him actually, and I really highly recommend visiting that site as well. I think that's kind of coming to the end of my presentation here. So just a real broad general discussion of the ER program, and I'd be happy to take questions and answer them if I can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. That was great. The first question is, can the references you listed be available after the webinar?
You betcha.
Perfect. Thank you. And the next question is, wondering what work the Society is doing in order to increase the social license for prescribed fire on the landscape.
Well, actually, it's funny because I meant to clarify one thing at the early stages there. Was it just to clarify that the Rocky Mountain Trench Natural Resources Society is a member of the steering committee and operations committee for the ER program. So if I'm, as far as getting what are we doing for the social license aspect of it for prescribed fires, in the past we had a wonderful person named Susan Bond who was instrumental in the ER program here, and she was really good at basically connecting with schools and putting out ads in the paper depicting some of the ER projects. Lately, there hasn't been a lot of that going on, but I think there is an appetite typically for more prescribed fires these days, because we're seeing essentially these wildfires that are happening and that are uncontrolled, unplanned, not on good venting days, and I think that I think the Trench Society is you know, we apart from basically promoting when we're doing the work, that's probably about all we're doing at this point. But I do feel that certainly we you know, as time goes on, we probably should promote it more. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, that's what I got for you for now.
Great, thanks, Mark. The next question is, can you provide a per hectare cost estimate of the different treatments?
I don't have exactly those numbers on me right in front of me, but what I can tell you is that they're obviously very variable. As you would probably know, if that person who's asking that question is probably going, how much does it cost per hectare for prescribed burn versus, or how much is it to use mastication versus hand treatment? And what I've seen from the little time that I've been in this position, of course, is that it's just highly variable. It's so stand and location specific. I mean, we have some projects that, you know, are, let's say, 2-hour drive from Cranbrook, for example, and it's like, if that's where the bulk of your contractors are available, that will dictate, that may influence the price per hectare, as well as just the stand itself. Is it on steep ground? Is it rocky? How how dense are the trees? Is it a 10,000 stems per hectare kind of treatment area? So it's really, really variable, and it's hard to kind of give you those numbers. What I could do is later on is, if I could speak to specific projects that we've done, and we could say this area here cost $3,200 per hectare, for example. So if people are really interested in that, feel free to contact me, and we can maybe talk about specific locations, and I might be able to narrow down that cost for you.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you work with large private landowners in addition to Crown, First Nations, and lands held by conservation groups?
Yes, so we work, we try to develop synergies where possible. So, the two largest landowners that we do tend to work with is Nature Trust of British Columbia, of Canada, and Nature Conservancy of Canada. And so we do certainly try to find those synergies where we have some overlapping potential to assist each other. And a lot of times these get kind of worked out earlier in the year. Once a year we have this thing called a MAP meeting that's hosted by the Forest District here in Cranbrook. And it's an opportunity for basically other landowners that want to do projects and treatments on the ground to meet up with other proponents that want to do work perhaps in the same area. And so we have had these scenarios where we've had these synergies. Just 2 years ago, I believe, for example, like in the Cranbrook Community Forest, there was some work done from through the Trench Society to do work in that community forest. So there are certainly many opportunities that have happened in the past where we've worked with a variety of landowners.
Great, thanks, Mark. The next question is, in the mid-90s, Society claimed over 3,500 acres of grasslands were encroached upon annually. What is the level of encroachment today, more or less? How much land is treated for encroachment in the Trench today?
That's a great question. I don't have a specific number there for you. I think what I blurted out earlier was that almost 50% of the historical grasslands have been lost due to encroachment and stuff. So I don't have a specific number for you, but I can give some folks a few numbers here that I meant to give you a little earlier when I was discussing the natural NDT4 area, which was at 250 hectares. And then I talked about how open forest and open range within that NDT forest or ecosystem is approximately 110,000 hectares. I can go into a little more detail regarding that. And I just learned these numbers actually at a recent steering committee meeting that I was at. And it may highlight, or maybe not necessarily directly answer that question, but it's maybe more food for thought, I suppose. But essentially what I've got here is that in the 65,000 hectare core grassland area that the ER program has kind of committed to try to manage, to date, there's 19,000 hectares that are in the maintenance mode. So that means basically they've done treatments, they've completed the treatments, things in that 19,000 hectares are now just in maintaining mode. So it's a matter of people going out, re-looking at these sites in the future and identifying whether or not another treatment will be required. So that's 19,000 hectares. And then we have 21,000 hectares that some work's been done but not completed. So basically, a good chunk of the area, perhaps there's been, let's say, logging's been happened, or perhaps there's been some hand treatment, but it may not be completely done yet. There might be still one more treatment that's required, whether it's maybe a prescribed fire or maybe even just another walkthrough to determine whether or not it requires another treatment. So there's that 21,000 hectare piece. And then there's 13,000 hectares that is basically in the, we call the planning. It's done, but there's no treatment on the ground that's happened yet. So there's some form of, there might be a prescription written for it. It might be in a plan, but there's no actual on the ground treatment that's happened there yet. And then there's 13,000 outstanding that nothing has been done at all to it yet at this point. So to sum that up, basically 50,000 hectares has had some form of work done on it. And over 20 years, the program has spent approximately $20 million. So I might have gone way overboard from what that question was about, but that kind of gives you a few numbers to work with to kind of give you an idea of what's been happening out there. So yeah, I hope that in a long way around that, I hope that sort of answers your question. And if I can't answer these questions, please feel free to email them to me. And I work with many folks that I can kind of get this information from that have the knowledge and the experience in the background too. So.
Great, thanks, Marc. And we can also provide Marc's email in the follow-up email that we'll send out after the webinar. The next question is there a plan to bring together all the monitoring results to assess the effects of treatment?
There has been, I think when you read the blueprint for action and some of the stuff that you'll find on the ER Trent's website, that it clearly kind of speaks to basically just that, like how are we able to take all this information and properly manage it so that we're really getting kind of what we want to get out of it. And I know that from the last steering committee meeting I was at, it was unfortunately kind of lower on the totem pole of things that were being discussed, but it is something that's on the radar, and it's being kind of defined, like how we're going to take all this information and start to utilize it better, more efficiently, essentially. But I don't have that direct answer for that one, so I'm sorry about that.
Great. The next question is, what do you see as some of the key challenges moving the ER program forward today and into the future?
I think like many other programs out there, funding is always a concern and a challenge. I think having support and commitment is another challenge. And then when I say that, I just mean it's because there's such a broad number of organizations that are involved to kind of continue to make this an important program and continue the buy-in is one of the challenges. That said, I would say that over 20 years, the program, 20 plus years of the program operating, it has many great success stories, and I think that it'll continue to go down this road of being an effective tool. Because one thing I think, when I spoke with some folks here, I think it was Randy that maybe told it to me this way, and I thought about it, and that makes a lot of sense. Like the ecosystem restoration program really is a really great program in a way that it really touches a lot of the things that most people are concerned about in the province. It's dealing with some of these landscape level wildfire issues that we're dealing with. It's looking at basically how to reduce those fuel loads. It really, it speaks to basically how to manage for basically wildlife and the habitat loss. And I think it's just such a great program. But again, it's the funding, of course, and the dedication from key individuals and folks to basically keep the program as being an important aspect. But I think today we're seeing in BC is that there's a lot of concerns about wildfires affecting homes and communities. And so I think the shift has kind of gone to that world. And I think we're going to be a tool in that toolbox to help out with that. Yeah, anyway, so I don't know if I've answered exactly the question as far as challenges, but those are probably the two key ones, is basically the funding and then the support as well.
Thanks, Marc. The next question is, are you partnering with regional districts and municipalities to tackle issues around risks to rural communities?
Yes, we certainly are. Where there's that, I think what's key there is that we're partnering them where the overlap is meeting the scope of the ecosystem restoration program. The ecosystem restoration program was not designed to necessarily remove trees around a community 100% to prevent it from wildfire affecting their homes. Ecosystem restoration program was designed to deal up more of a landscape level kind of type of treatment in the core areas. And so there are many communities that kind of where we have that overlap. And so that's where it's a great opportunity to work with the regional district on those kind of projects. So I would say that yes, there is those opportunities. It just really depends on where it is. And yeah, that's my answer, I guess.
Thank you. The next question is, are there any plans to expand the restoration efforts into other ecosystems, such as subalpine meadows?
I would say at this point, from what I know, I would say no, just because the scope again of the program is geared to deal with ecosystem in that natural disturbance type 4 ecosystem. And so that kind of limits basically the area that we're working in terms of elevation and just the type of environment that we're working in. So I don't think that there's plans at this point to expand beyond.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That's the end of the questions. I just would like to extend our thanks to you for presenting today. That was a really excellent presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone else for participating in today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. Please expect a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to an online post survey with 7 questions. We appreciate your feedback as it will help us plan future webinars. And if you have any future webinar ideas, please let us know. This is our last webinar for this year, so please join us next year for our 2020 Winter Webinar Series. Thanks again, Mark. Really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and have a good week here, or good weekend.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.